Whenever government spending increases above 40% of GDP, and whenever taxes go above that level, you get a permanent reduction of GDP growth by at least 1 percentage point in real terms per year. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but given that this is the difference between 3 and 2% growth, or 3.5%.
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have someone on who knows a lot about European economy, knows a lot about international comparisons, knows a lot about America and a lot of the states, and has been doing a lot of great work across the country. And it's none other than Dr. Sven Larson. Sven, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, great. I'm happy to have you on, and it's going to be a great discussion today. Let me start by giving the audience your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So, Dr. Larson is a political economist and author. He received a PhD in economics from Roskilde University, Denmark. Originally from Sweden, he lives in America for the past 16 years. He has worked in politics and public policy. He has written several books, including Democracy or Socialism, The Faithful Question for America in 2024, which we'll cover today, along with a whole bunch of other things about Europe and some other issues. But before we get started with all that, Sven, why do you do what you do every day?
That's an interesting question, Vance, because I keep asking myself that with all the frustrations of that comes with the work. As you said, I'm originally from Sweden. Back about just over 30 years ago, Sweden went through a very bad economic crisis. When GDP collapsed for 3 years, unemployment went from virtually nothing to 18%. It was an enormous crisis, and the central bank raised the interest rates to 500% to curb speculation. It was absolute macroeconomic insanity. I saw this. I had graduated from college. I was in grad school, and I was looking at all this. I was asking my professors, what the heck's going on here?
Yeah.
And they couldn't answer the questions. And I was also active in politics. So I started looking around for answers. Why is the economy collapsing now? To make a long story short, I was to make some money on the side. I was working as a teaching assistant for an economics class for social workers, and they were the kind who came from the street, if I put it that way. Everything academic that they were confronted with, they said, "What does this have to do with my work?" And it was in a setting like that I took all my academic knowledge and presented to them, and they asked exactly that. What does this have to do with me? How does this improve the life of the people that we are working with? And it got me thinking. Long story short, I quit the grad school program I was in Sweden, went to Denmark because I found a much better one there. It resulted in a dissertation about uncertainty and macroeconomic stability and economic policy, how that fits into the picture. So basically, I can say that's what I've been doing since then. The main question that drives me, and I'm really glad you asked this because it's so important for us, is how does government, well-intended as it may be, screw up the economy for regular people, for, just the average Joe? If I were to summarize what I do and why I do it, it's because I want an answer to that question. And how can we do something better than that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, it's one that I try to talk a lot about here on the Let People Prosper Show. Kind of my driving force is to let people prosper. Well, of course, that asks a lot of questions about what the roles of government are. How should society run? What's the institutional framework that best allows for people to prosper? And there's a lot of great research in that area. And it seems like you're a great person to talk to about this because of your background and kind of what drives you. I like that a lot. What are some of the areas that you got to where you are today? You talked a little bit about that, from changing grad schools, from this question to keep you going. But how did you then get into public policy and politics, or just the political economy, if you will, here in America?
I finished my grad school in 1999 in Denmark. It took another year before I got my PhD because, as you know, once you're done, they always want some changes to it. So in early 2000, I got my PhD. My dissertation was published with an international academic publishing house. While I was doing that, I was thinking I should probably just stick to academia because that's so fun. I got an offer to come over to a small liberal arts college in upstate New York in 2002. So I moved there. The academic climate in America was not what I expected it to be. It was much far further to the left. So after 3 years there, I left. I went to work for free market think tanks instead. So I started with the American Institute for Economic Research, worked for the Center for Freedom and Prosperity in Washington. I freelanced a couple of years for other think tanks, did a stint down in South Carolina, moved to Wyoming. So I got into public policy, and you know how tightly that is connected to politics.
Yes.
So I started working with basically trying to be an engineer in economic policy. And that is both rewarding and stimulating. What I found most interesting was how much more you could get done at the state level than at the federal level. I mean, you know this very well from your time with TPPF, and you can compare that because you worked at the OMB in Washington.
That's right.
The biggest problem and the biggest challenge that I still like to work with, and what keeps me in this business, is that you can actually see the difference when you talk to people, and when some guy who reads what you write gets back to you and says, I get it now. Now I can go to my representative and present your arguments. I'll give you just an example. In 2016, when I was working for the Wyoming Liberty Group up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the legislature, which is almost all Republican, presented a big package for raising taxes. I could not believe it when I started looking at it. It was a very large increase. They would have increased taxes by $4,000 for a family of four, not directly, but if you take all the taxes into account, all the property taxes, taxes on expanding sales tax and so on, the weight of that would have crushed the Wyoming economy. And I was the only one who started fighting that. But I was able over 4 years to actually turn the tide. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying what an impact you can have if you really want to. And we were able to stop those tax hikes. That's the rewarding part. And that's why I like doing what I'm doing. Again, you're an engineer in economic policy, essentially.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I taught in academia for a couple of years as well, and found a better home for me, for my career in public policy. Because, the other thing that got me into public policy was, I want to write papers that people are going to read and maybe have some influence on what's happening today, versus in academia. I still publish in academic journals. I try to keep my foot in that door, but I know that very few people are probably going to read these articles. And when you write public policy, to your point, you can reach a much broader audience. In fact, I feel like some of the public policy work I'm doing is still teaching. I feel like I am a teacher at heart. It's just a different audience, right? Whether it's media or these podcasts or whatever else. And we need folks like us who are able to do that, because you have a lot of folks in academia where division of labor, that's not their specialization. They're not able to express that in that way, but they're great at research, and we need that division of labor and specialization. So I'm glad that you found your calling in this space. I think we'd like to talk about, here with you today, Sven, is Europe and your knowledge of what was going on there, some of the political institutions that are there that seems to work well, not to work so well. I haven't talked about that much yet on the Let People Prosper show, but I think with your knowledge, it'd be great for other people to know, because there are good lessons, but there are also lessons that are good, but also lessons that are bad that we need to learn. So where would you like to start when you're thinking about Europe, and where do you like to go with that?
That's a great area, something that is, as you say, very important for Americans to understand, because the left tends to draw on Europe when they want to bring new ideas over. I write for the European Conservative. I'm an economics writer there, so I write regularly. I follow regularly the European economy. Back in 2018, I published a book called The Rise of Big Government, where I show how the American welfare state is closely mimicking European welfare states when it comes to the design of entitlement programs, the economic redistribution built into it, and so on. And so there's a very important reason for Americans to understand Europe, in that what happens there is 5, 10, 15 years ahead of where we're heading. Europe today is in an economic quagmire. If you talk about Europe writ large, there are exceptions. But if you look at countries like Germany, France, Britain, the smaller countries, of course, around them, basically all countries that are included in the Eurozone and its immediate vicinity, are in an economic quagmire. One of the main reason, I would say, the main reason is that they have expanded government spending and raised taxes beyond the critical level where GDP growth is actually depressed by the mere size of government. And there is a statistical threshold. I have never been able to explain exactly why it is where it is, but it is there. If you look at the statistics, whenever government spending increases above 40% of GDP, and whenever taxes go above that level, you get a permanent reduction of GDP growth by at least 1 percentage point in real terms per year. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but given that this is the difference between 3 and 2% growth, or 3.5% and 2% growth, it means a lot over time. It essentially means the difference between people getting real paycheck increases versus just, being stagnant in their standard of living. That's what it means at the ground level.
Yeah.
And Europe has passed that 40% threshold. Europe is in a state where the economy is not moving forward. There are exceptions, again. I'll get back to them in just a second. When I look at their government program, the spending programs that they have, and I look at where we are, I can see we're just behind them, moving in exactly the same direction, and we're importing everything that they have done, and we're copying that without really thinking about the long-term consequences. Of course, the left likes it because they like the economic redistribution part, but we as conservatives should be very concerned, because what it means is that we end up in the same quagmire. And as you know very well, when you don't have enough economic growth, the political battle over the tax dollars increases. One of the things that Europe has proven to us is that when those battles increase, nothing happens. Nobody moves in any direction. You just slowly sink into this quagmire, the sinkhole of economic stagnation. Now, I would like to mention one exception to this, but that's Hungary. The Hungarian government redesigned their welfare state, I would say about 10 years ago, away from economic redistribution. They said, we're going to focus on supporting families and the formation and the growth of families. So regardless of they said, we're not going to look at people's income primarily. We're going to look at whether or not they want to have more kids, and they want to stay married, they want to buy a house, they want to find some trajectory forward as a family in their lives. That was the mission of their welfare state. By refocusing in that way, they have been able to reduce government presence in the economy, stabilize their public finances, not perfectly, but they're one of the best in Europe in doing that. They have strong economic growth, one of the highest in Europe. They've been in the top 5 consistently for 10 years, up until about last year. And interestingly, they see also, if you want to extend it into looking at the formation of families, they've actually increased birth rates. So Hungary is an interesting exception to the rule, which shows that you can do things differently and you get different results.
Yeah, great points there. I think that threshold you said, 40%, would that be both federal and local government spending together, or is that just the federal or the national type of government?
No, it's the consolidated government sector. So it's all of it added up. That's an important point to make.
Yeah, because even in the U.S., I mean, you have the federal government where it's close to 25% now. It's pretty high. But then when you add in state and local government spending, that adds on about another 10 percentage points. So you're probably closer to 35. We're getting close to 40% now.
Exactly. We are. Yeah.
So your point is well taken, that, look, we're already reaching that point of kind of no return if we're going to keep spending the way that we are.
Yes, precisely. And it becomes not economically, but politically, it becomes a point of no return, because once you get that resource starvation from the economic stagnation, once tax revenue is not growing the way the politicians want them to, they start fighting even harder over how to use that money and refuse to concede anything. And this is exactly what we've seen in Europe. It's happening here too. And as we both know very well, there's one more point I want to make about Europe when it comes to comparison to America. It's that in Europe, the youth unemployment rate has been, it's not 20% now, but it's been up there toward well over where we are, about twice as high as we have been. This means that young people who grow up in the European welfare states have no future. It's almost impossible for them to get in on the labor market. It's almost impossible for them to become self-sufficient, build a professional career, start a life. Our young can still do that. But when you get to the point where the young can no longer get in, they lose attachment to society in so many ways, not just economically, but socially, morally, etc. So you get sort of an erosion of society from underneath. We haven't reached that point, but that's the next toll that our welfare state is going to take. That when the economy stagnates, there are no new jobs for the young, and they become wards of the state, if you will. Rely on their parents, rely on the welfare state much more than we're seeing now. So we really have to turn the tide here if we're not going to repeat another European mistake.
Great points there, Sven. I was just looking this up, and so as of 2022, so it says Europe and Central Asia, the European Union was 15.84% was the unemployment rate, the youth unemployment rate. North America was 8.1%. So almost double in Europe compared to what is in the United States or in North America, the way they put this together. And so that is quite fascinating, because if you're not putting yourself in and getting a job early on, you're not getting on those lower rungs of the ladder to then move up the income spectrum. And you're also reducing your longer term prosperity or income gains, along with the productivity, the skills, the experience, and everything else. And it's interesting. And I don't know if you've seen this as much in Europe, Sven, as in America, but the younger millennials, which I'm considered a millennial, I'm like right at the edge of it. I was born in 1981, so I'm like one of the older ones. But the younger millennials and the Gen Zers, a lot of them don't want to work as much. They're waiting to work, which could be a fault of their parents. I don't know. Maybe they don't want them to work as much, or there's not this same sort of work mentality. Do you also find that in Europe? And is it because of the culture, or is it because of the government influence on the economy with having high minimum wages and higher taxes, where they just say, you know what, the trade-offs are too high?
That's a very interesting question. As it happens, when my son graduated high school, there was another kid in the extended family who graduated high school in Sweden. My son and his class, every one of his friends, he and every one of them had plans. They were going to go into the military. One was going to go to Catholic seminar. Some were going to college. Others had trade school plans, or they wanted to learn a trade, etc. Everybody had plans. Everybody was optimistic. Over in Sweden, the graduating class in that high school, everybody said, "Welcome to unemployment."
Wow.
What happened over there? It was not an atypical example. On the contrary, there's a lot of it. I don't think they even have the concept of not wanting to work because they really don't have a choice. On the contrary, I think if you look at the extreme examples in Europe, if you take Greece, where you had the 60% youth unemployment rate when things were at their worst about a decade ago, people desperately left Greece for other countries, even Romania, which at the time was a really poor economy. They went there just because they wanted something else. So I think there's a big middle zone there where our young, many of them can say we can afford not to work because the opportunities are there when we want them, basically. But once those opportunities are taken away, there comes a period of I think, disenfranchisement, and until you get to the point where people are just sheer desperation takes over and they start looking for it. And that is the process from the luxury of not having to work all the way down to that desperation. That's a social disintegration process that we do not want. And this is why we need the kind of economy that you and I are working for, one with limited government, one with great entrepreneurial opportunities. Anybody who comes from any background should have the same opportunities to build a life, and that's why it's so important that we preserve this before we lose the last few pillars of social and economic stability.
Preach, Sven. Preach. Those are great points. I mean, I've been trying to talk more and more about free market capitalism, which gets a bad rap these days, unfortunately, because everyone's wanting to blame capitalism, and I'm like, where's capitalism at? Too often, when you think about healthcare, education, and other things, it's dominated by government spending, which is taxpayer money redistributed from the productive private sector. And so we have to be careful, even when we're talking about, and I'd love to give you your thoughts about what's happening in Europe, but there's a big push for industrial policy in America. And I don't know where you're at on this, but I'm very skeptical of it. In fact, I think it's going to work. I think it's going to make things worse off here in America. But there's this push that says, we need government to come in and subsidize things, provide tax breaks, pick winners and losers in the process. But every time we're picking winners and the winner, there is that loser. And sometimes we see them, but many times we don't. The seen versus the unseen. You have, these dispersed benefits, but you have the concentrated benefits here, but dispersed costs that you oftentimes don't see. And I'm concerned about the future of the country. Going back to your recent book, Democracy or Socialism, the fateful question for America in 2024, I'm right there with you. I'm asking this same question, given what's happening, given the two that are probably going to be the main contenders for the Democrats and Republicans with President Biden and former President Trump. It's going to be an interesting process where I'm concerned that we're going to turn it more into Europe. And so I wonder, from your background and experience, what are you thinking about whenever you see where America is going and how we should learn some of these lessons from Europe?
Pick 3 or 4 random stock markets in Europe.
Yeah.
Go back 50 years. Look at the companies that dominated these stock markets back then, and look at which companies dominate the stock markets now. Take for example, the best example is, of course, Germany, but you can also go to Sweden and you will see that the same big companies that dominated the stock markets then, they're still there. They're still the big ones to invest in. Look at the American stock market. We have a completely new set of business corporations that dominate the indexes. This is a symbol of industrial stagnation versus industrial dynamics.
Yeah.
The Europeans have for a very, very long time prioritized what you call industrial policy, with subsidies, tax breaks, regulations benefiting certain businesses over others. It has resulted in 2 things. First of all, it has entrenched old, low productivity companies that are shielded from competition by means of government money and taxpayer subsidies, which in turn has led to when you have lower productivity, you also get lower economic growth, of course, weaker ability for these industries to pay better wages and so on. The other thing that has happened is that it has completely wiped out innovation. Who is going to try to compete with a big company X, that has for 10, 15, 20 years been receiving subsidies from government and has a big public affairs department under their CEO that lobbies government for more money and built good relations with influential politicians? Who's going to come in and try to compete with them? There is a reason why we have such a dynamic economy, or have had it. We're still there, but we've lost a little bit of that. I think we got more of it back under Trump, because of especially because of his tax reform, which I think was really good, but also his deregulation policies. So we still have that dynamics, and I hope we can get back more of it. The Europeans have lost that. The only way you can see some industrial innovation in Europe, ironically, is when government subsidizes it. The green transition that they talk about, which is more and more turning out to be an unmitigated disaster. It's choking the German economy, which is everybody is all of a sudden picking up to. When you do these industrial policy projects, the consequences don't stay within just that company or that branch, because a big corporation receiving government money, it buys products from it can have hundreds of suppliers around the country in regions that otherwise wouldn't have any jobs. So when this company that is subsidized stagnates, it starts cutting those off. It starts cutting off those supply chains and moving them to even cheaper suppliers. So you spread economic stagnation instead of spreading economic innovation.
No, that's a great point. And I think it goes back to the institutions, right? The institutional framework of these different entities and countries and state and local governments, as you know, working with different state think tanks and other states across just America. Each one has their own, whether you compare California with Texas, where I'm at, or New York and Florida, or even Wyoming, right? Each one has their own institutional framework. It's interesting to really look at the different countries when you think about what's happening in Europe. And one other thing that I wanted to touch on, though, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is some people will claim they want to be more like Sweden, for example, because they consider them to be a socialist country. But whenever you look at some of the measures of economic freedom of the world, whether it's the Fraser Institute, Heritage, I think has one, Cato may have one. I think they all kind of, it's very similar. But those countries, especially I'm thinking about economic freedom of the world by the Fraser Institute, Sweden ranks near the top as one of the most free countries in the world. And so I wonder, whenever you hear this, I'm sure you have a lot, why can't we just be more like Sweden and be more socialist? What do you say to them about that?
I say, look at how those indexes are constructed. Government takes half of your income. I was just texting with a friend this morning over there who I was trying to encourage him to start a business. And he said, no, government's going to take 60% of everything I make. Why bother?
Yeah.
So government takes at least half of what you make. You pay 25% value-added tax on top of the income tax that starts at over 30%, ends at 60%. You have no choice in healthcare, absolutely none. Government tells you what to do. Swedish school choice, which a lot of people tout, and they try to say we should bring that to America. It's really not. It's government-run school choice. I can explain that in detail if anybody wants to hear about it. Government forces you to save money for your own economic security in their programs. There are so many ways that government in Sweden restrains the freedom of the regular citizen. Corporations are relatively free because there's a relatively low tax rate, and they kind of deregulated everything that has to do with just the corporation. But try to defy your union. Try to not sign a union contract in America, and you'll see what happens. Tesla tried that now. It didn't work. Unions are essentially a government proxy over there. No, Sweden is not an example of economic freedom. The problem is with those indexes that don't put the right value on things like, for example, very high taxes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the other things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about their school choice at some time, because that's quite interesting, especially given the debates that are going on with the kind of the school choice revolution here in the United States, which I hope we see more of. I'm a fan of school choice. I hope we get more of that. We've also had the flat tax revolution that's happening across many states, which is a good sign. I hope that continues. But the other thing that, and you and I have kind of talked about this some, is on what I'm calling sustainable budgets, and looking at spending limits or fiscal rule in general. You have the Swiss debt break, you have other types of rules, the Colorado's taxpayer bill of rights, and things of that nature that helps to basically put a governor on how fast that these state governments or just government can grow. But I wonder, with kind of your research in this area, what do you recommend for those who are influencers who are listening to the show, whether it be on, a fiscal rule or tax system or deregulation? What would you want to leave them with as key recommendations for a flourishing economy?
I wrote an article about 7 years ago about the Swiss debt break, and I analyzed how it could work in America. It was for the General Government and Regulation. It's actually published in Ukraine.
Okay.
Where I showed that the Swiss debt break could work. You have to make some modifications. So it's kind of a promising concept. Dan Mitchell over at the Center for Freedom and Prosperity has talked a lot about it. So he's the real expert on that one.
Yeah.
When it comes to fiscal rules generally, unfortunately, I think we have, or rather, Congress has proven that they can break any one of those as much as whenever they want. Yeah. So I think it's feeble to spend more time on trying to get something like that passed. It would be a Tabor style could be a good stopgap, but it has to be treated only as a stopgap, just so we can get some breathing room to get real reforms done. What I would like to see is a complete, and the Heritage Foundation actually has some ideas along this line, a redesign of the entitlement programs, not only Social Security, not only Medicare, but Medicaid, all of them. And I'm going further than Heritage here. I want to point that out. But where you focus on providing basic but dignified benefits for those who really need them, those who really are without any other means of supporting themselves. And then everybody else, the rest of us, are given the opportunity to provide for ourselves, because you can now reduce taxes and open the economy a lot more. I think if you do that, you decouple the benefits programs, the government spending, from necessity of increasing spending because you want economic redistribution. If you take the economic redistribution out of the picture and focus on providing a basic but dignified welfare system, it is a whole lot easier to maintain that fiscally. We can balance the budget. We can take away the $1 trillion a year that we now spend on interest to keep our debt solvent, so to speak. And we can focus on national security, and we can focus on reducing taxes and making life more affordable for people.
Well, that's great. I mean, I think a big part of your work, and I'll make sure to put this in the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com, but some links to your work and the things that you've been doing at the European Conservative, I think are right on target. And, I look forward to more of our discussions on LinkedIn or elsewhere. I enjoy reading your work, which I'll make sure I put in the show notes page as well. And I think these are all good ideas that we need to find ways to limit the size and scope of government, because if we don't, we know through evidence, through economic theory, and through actual data of how that impacts people over time. And it's not good. We need more individual liberty and personal responsibility and free market capitalism. I think those are the best ways to let people prosper. And it's really been a pleasure having you on, Sven. And I don't know if you have any last words that you'd like to say before we go.
No, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to coming back here.
Okay, great. Well, God bless you and your family, Sven. And for the audience, please go and give us a 5-star rating, if you will. Share this with your friends and family so we can get this information out here. And we really got to make sure that America doesn't turn into a lot of the countries of Europe, where you have this economic malaise and other things that are going on. And unfortunately, I think we're pretty close to that, if we're not already there. So we've got a lot of work to do. But until next time, let people prosper.